Ah, Hello, dear audience. Today it is a true special day for our channel. We have a most wonderful guest, a man who needs no introduction, the one who basically revived en masse symbolic thinking in the West, Jonathan Pageau. Thank you for
It's
coming.
nice to meet you, Pablo.
And so today we have quite a huge, I would say, and broad list of topics we would want to talk about. They will talk about problems of identity, political community, international order. But where we want to start, I think, is one of the most basic elements of what's happening, or what is playing out in front of our eyes. And I've been entertained the thought that all main, let's say, paradigms of thinking like liberalism, communism, ethnonationalism, which seems to be self-evident, which seems to be dominant in the modern political discourse, are in fact just the brothers fighting over that killed their own father of Enlightenment, and now they're just effectively trying over its inheritance and over its dead body. Um,
Hmm.
since you made a lot of videos about this topic, I would maybe like you to elaborate on, like, to say whether it's an overstretch or maybe it's not deep enough understanding of the process.
Yeah, well, it depends on what angle you want to look at. And so one of the aspects, so the Enlightenment obviously is it's a very broad event. Uh, but one of the aspects of the Enlightenment is related to, let's say, rationalism or to the creation of scientific processes, or in some ways the fine-tuning of those processes, and also making that type of thinking, the analytical type of thinking, uh, you could say, making it the mode of being that is preferred. Maybe that's a good way of saying it. And, and that leads downstream to many things that, when we look at them, we find very positive. Like it increases, obviously, the capacity to quantify, to name and to predict phenomena, and therefore it leads to the type of scientific progress that we have seen. But if you take that as a mode of thinking, that's a way of, you have to understand that you can't avoid the corollaries of that type of thinking. So if you have an analytic mode of thinking where you try to create strong identities that you then analyze and predict, you create these so it does things like, for example, the creation of encyclopedias, right? The creation of dictionaries, all of this type of attitude where we want to fix the phenomena, define it, create a very strong boundary around it so we can analyze it, predict it, and all that. Well, that has corollaries, which are the problem, for example, of nation states. So nation states are born out of that thinking, and ethnic divisions, the way that we think of them in the modern age, are also born out of that division, because just like we want to identify species of animals in order to analyze them and look at their behaviors, we do the same with humans, and we do the same with nations. So instead of having, broad empires with fuzzy borders and, and kind of a no man's land and ambiguous spaces, we want to have nations with clear marginal lines, and we create maps, and we have maps that are, the ancient maps were basically just cosmic descriptions of relations of large, like identities. And so if you look at the T map, for example, in the Middle Ages, it's basically just Europe, Africa, Asia in like a flower pattern, and it has nothing to do, like, it has very little to do with the type of analytic thinking that we apply to the world now. So, and like you said, how it happens is that has corollaries, which is all the modern political movements are in some ways downstream from that, whether it is the libertarian who wants to be completely autonomous and free from all relationship to other beings, or whether it is the ethno-nationalist that wants to segregate himself and create this really tight, clear identity border around their identity, or whether it is the communist that in some ways is actually strangely akin to the libertarian, though with a different strategy. But so you can see the downstream from this type of thinking, you have all kinds of problems or political solutions that, although they fight amongst themselves, like you mentioned at the introduction, they are in some ways, they're not in some ways, they are just fruits of the same origin.
Well, you brought so many points which I would like to elaborate. I guess I will start with a quick point. I really like the idea of borders because I think it's one of the most fascinating uh, element of modern reality when people treat borders as something both sacred, fixed, and natural, whereas historically there have been never any of these three things. Effectively, all borders in history are frontiers. They're constantly moving. They might not be
Yeah.
completely flexible, but it's always a movable line. Like there is, I think, maybe one of few borders in the world which like lasted for hundreds of years, and it's something like between a small Duke of Andorra and the rest of Spain, like in like peninsula. But generally speaking, borders are always something which is moved. And I think that's kind of the core weakness of rationalist thinking, which I think we can address it now, that it tries to freeze time. All of these kind of all of these ideologies, they try to freeze time. So let's say we find the perfect mapping of something of a moment, being at the end of history of Fukuyama, or like liberal
Right.
end of history, communist, and then let's freeze it. It won't go any further. Nothing will ever happen. So let's freeze these borders. And when you ask the most simple question, why these borders? So why no movement? Then it falls apart. Like it just falls apart.
Yeah, because if you ask the question, let's say in terms of nationalism, let's say the nationalisms that developed very strongly at the beginning of the late
Yeah.
19th, early 20th century, you ask yourself, oh, okay, so does that mean that now this is it forever? Like you said, like we're just going to keep these lines forever? And you can see it, like in some ways, there is a sense in which if you want to understand, like if you want to understand, let's say, where the political movement is, you can see you have to look at where the borders are absolute and unquestionable, and where the borders are all of a sudden treated as completely arbitrary and ridiculous, and as if not all the borders are actually have the same characteristic. But when you look at political movements, you can notice that when all of a sudden they start to treat certain borders as arbitrary and ridiculous, you think, oh, okay, now I see where the wind is shifting. I can kind of see. But like you said, what's interesting about that is, in some ways, the postmodern reaction to the modern thinking is in some ways a realization that identities have fuzziness, right? That identities have hybridity, that identities produce these intermediary states that the modern rationalist wants to eliminate, but that you can't completely eliminate. And so you could say that if you try to eliminate the fuzziness, then at some point it has revenge on you, because you build it up in the borders. Then at some point it overwhelms the identity. You can't avoid it forever.
I absolutely agree. This revenge of the fuzziness, it's a great phrase I might borrow, because that is a paradox. Like those people who, like, I find it quite often, mostly right now in this, I don't know how to call this movement, let's say anti-Gnostic, anti-Marxist movement in the West, which is doing like quite a lot of good of educational work, and it's remarkable. But they keep missing this core element, like at least most of them, that what they're fighting against, it's the consequences of the actions of their heroes. It's like you brought it upon yourself. And that's a that's why I started the conversation from Enlightenment, because as you said, so once you see a political community as something quantifiable, named, predictable, rationalized, you will end up in those areas. Like then you will have this revenge of fuzziness, and then just those who do it better than you will start eating you. But it's still infighting, as long as you don't address this foundational stones that political
Yeah.
communities are neither quantifiable and predictable. They're quite
Yeah.
different in their nature.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to see how we're going to solve the problem, because it's like once you start to crystallize things, right? Once you start to make these imaginal lines, and you start to create, because imaginal line has no space between it. So if you want to, like, let's say, I mean, I'm talking about nations, but you can use this for any type of category, right? Imaginal line has no fuzziness, and therefore, who's going to give? Like, how are you going to recreate that fuzziness when it's the imaginal line is there? It means that you're looking at war you're looking at
War
least the
history.
potential idea of war all the time, because you've got these lines that are, you don't have the kind of hybrid a hybrid buffer between the empire that you would have, for example, between the Roman and the Persian Empire, for example. So it's a problematic thing. And so therefore what happens is the dream of abolishing the borders becomes almost necessary. So that's why it sounds contradictory, but the rationalism and the desire to let's say the analytic mode of creating all these nation states, it ultimately also leads to a dream of a one world government. Like it leads to the dream of something like communism, where the borders all dissolve, because the problem of the borders is a real problem. And if you ignore it, then you have World War I and you have World War II. And it's like these are issues that the idea that went away, it's like we're not going to have that again, is so completely ridiculous as we see now. But then there's a dream of saying, well, then we should have all the borders dissolved, right? So this is the funny thing about the movement of the Enlightenment, the movement of modernism, is that because of its dialectical structure, right, it tends to do that, and that's in some ways, I think that's one thing that people like Hegel or Marx intuited rightly, that process is in some ways inevitable for
yeah, as long as you have this foundation, it is
yeah,
inevitable. I think
that's
that,
right.
and it's very hard to identify the foundation,
Well,
which
it's
I
a
want to
false
talk a bit.
foundation. Oh, for sure,
It
it's a
is a
false
false
foundation.
foundation, yeah. It is,
Yeah.
but it became so natural, it became self-evident, and that's why we're having conversations like this, to just effectively an exercise of as a way of thinking, or like trying to identify this foundation as not self-evident, that it is not like how it is or how it always been. And your example of like historical borders, Roman Empire, like it's very interesting and core example, this whole idea of this whole idea of fluidity on the border. But we need to understand that this fluidity, the disappearance of this fluidity, exactly hasn't always been a natural process of dying out. Again, we cannot avoid talking about a political actor, like a political subject, a political sovereign, who deliberately wanted to destroy this imperial fluidity. And I think I will offer, I won't talk about it then, but I will, I guess, offer it right now. The way I see the hierarchy of political communities, and the way we see it nowadays, and then where the kind of trick happens. So in my idea, in my understanding, on the bottom lies ecclesia, in a broad scheme of things. Like you can call it a political community, any local community, but it is effectively a community. Everybody knows it, everybody supposedly love it, like all this productive multiplicity, creative multiplicity, not oppressive multiplicity, like a church. That's why I think ecclesia is the best way of describing it. And
A
then
class, you said?
a church, no, a church.
A church, yeah, okay,
A
church.
church, a church, sorry,
Yeah.
a church. And then on a second level of, let's say, imagination, nowadays we are supposed to have something like nation state. Historically, it hasn't always been the case. It can be called like a kingdom, but so something of this level of analysis, like something that unites many classes together, but it's big enough. That's big enough to act in history. Something big enough to act enough as a sovereign. And then there is a third level of imperium, let's say, of empire. Like there's something which is truly unifying and like is much stronger than all of those like kingdoms on their own. And the version of history which, let's say, we are usually taught in the history books and Western people to understand, is empire is evil and oppressive, and it oppresses its local communities, local ecclesias. But in my opinion, it's a trick, because actually it's empire and ecclesia which are usually way more in a flexible. If you read history books, you will see how much flexibility, how much gray zoning, how much borderlining like it allows. But what is the true ally is a nation state, or let's say a small kingdom, and what is even above an empire, this Tower of Babel, what I call it, or a globalist or a communist dream. So alliance is happening between the steps, but most people keep missing the structure, and that's why they think that nation state, for example, is an ally of local community, whereas historically nation state has never been an ally of local community. Historically, all nation states are literally created on a bones and blood of local communities, but they're sold as a history version, as on the contrary, something which fights to protect the local community from an oppressive empire, whereas the true master is kind of states on the shade, and it is this idea of Tower of Babel world without no borders. So, and that's what I think the paradox we're in. And that's why it's hard to have a conversation, because people rarely see this whole structure, at least the way I encounter. Maybe you see it
Yeah.
differently.
Well, I probably see it a little differently from you, in the sense
Hopefully.
that the way that I see it is that what you have is you basically have you need to have units that fit into other units, right? We all know that that's the way that you can't function. That's the best way to function, and that's the traditional way to function. The ancient way to function, you had to have things like family, clans, villages, in, like you said, kingdoms, or sometimes kingdoms that even had aristocracies that were like local fiefs or whatever, and then you move up into a kingdom, uh, and then that, let's say, that kingdom can become a part of an empire, like we saw during the Roman Empire, or obviously there are different forms of empire, even the Muslim Empire, or and so that has been for, I mean, since the Bronze Age, you could say, the traditional way of things to lay themselves out. And it's almost inevitable that we do it that way. The problem seems to arise, to me, when any of those level tries to subjugate the one under it, that is, tries to swallow it into itself. And so you can understand it with the bureaucratic nation state. The bureaucratic nation state is a good example, because we live in it, we experience it, where the state begins to see itself as protecting individuals from the intermediary structures. So it's like, oh, we need to protect children from parents. We need to protect children and people from the church. We need to protect people from clubs. And so you see all these stories, which are obviously inevitable, of abuse in families, abuse in clubs, abuse in churches, all these things. And it's like, oh, the state will protect us. And then what happens is you start to level the intermediary structures, and then you create a kind of individual state relationship. And that is corrosive. Like, it's corrosive to the identity of the person. And it ends up ultimately making the state into a form of tyranny, even without anybody willing it, particularly, because it has to take up, in its own authority, has to take up all those intermediary levels, which are not necessarily natural for it to do so. Now, the problem is that technology makes that possible in a way that in an ancient empire, you simply could not have done that, right? It's like the king could have said, I want to control everybody in my empire, but all right, how are you going to do it? Because you don't have the reach to do it. So technology makes that possible, and it makes it possible to dream, like you said, like we talked about, and I think a lot of people are kind of naturally moving towards that, to dream of a universal state, where now the globalist states will protect us from our nation state. That's the way that it's presented. It's like, oh, those horrible, dangerous ethno-nation states that are xenophobic, and they're all these things, and we accuse them, and they do all these things that are only for their own interest. We need a global interest. We need something that serves everyone. And so we're going to create this global structure that, with technology, will be capable of managing individuals here. That is the most, like you said, that's the most corrosive thing ever for Tower
And
of
it is
Babel
the
3.
same pattern. It's absolutely the same pattern, and it preys upon the same mistake, because the way you've been describing it, like to protect individual effectively against its community. But here is the lies the false contradictions, because I would argue even now, like subconsciously, to an extent, we are still a relatively healthy. We live a community. Like, people don't live as individual. We say we do live as individual. We do claim we live as individual, but we don't really.
Yeah.
We always live in a community. We always live as in something which is bigger than the sum of its parts. The sum can never be properly quantifiable, but as you said, the very manner that the state treats an individual, like, let's say, as something as exists on its own, this famous empty board of Locke. Basically, I think it's coming from effectively Locke and Hobbes, like effectively in modern way of thinking. But exactly the same pattern. He says, so let's just take these nation states as individual units, which historically they are not, and then let's devoid them of all other things, and then exactly use this bigger authority to protect, again, now individuals against the state. But it is the same pattern. And until you stop thinking about reality in terms of individuals, which I think it's a really huge challenge, it's really hard to start seeing like the other way of potential coexisting. It's a little bit problematic.
Well, I don't know if you read, maybe you haven't read it, but I wrote a paper last year for ARC, on subsidiarity. And in some ways, for me, this has been the thing that I want to bring about. Like, because I'm not a very political person in my engagements, like publicly. I'm political privately, like also in my own state. But I've been wanting to help people see that this subsidiary model as the most natural model, and how in some ways the false opposition, right? Because one of the issues with the classical liberal is that they tend to push towards the individual and the sovereignty of the individual, but they don't realize that as you push toward the sovereignty of the individual, even though you don't like it, you're necessarily making the power of the state more and more necessary, because you need something to fill in the subsidiary gaps of alignment, right? That are little communities and all these things that fit together to create something that is more akin to a natural system. So you have this opposition, right? Where the individual becomes more and more free, in parenthesis, and then the state becomes more and more powerful necessarily. And so that's why, like, that's why the strange coalition between rainbow coalition stuff and globalism, because it looks like, how do these two things fit together? Well, they completely fit together, because as you move towards idiosyncrasy, then you need the state. So it's like the idiosyncrasy becomes more and more pervasive, and therefore we need someone to protect all of us from each other, right? Because now we all hate each other.
It's the same, yeah. The ideal in this idiosyncratic moment, we have this famous, panopticon image, the one eye in the middle and every single individual in its own cell. Like, that's the most famous image of where it cannot not go. Like, there is no way of going it. But kind of, I think our audience knows it, and I just want, I guess, to highlight the things which lead to this. And I think we mentioned one important question in this paper, or in some other of your conversation, which liberals often don't get. They consider any subsidiary arbitrary, and it's not. Subsidiaries are not arbitrary. And if you treat individual as a primary element of analysis, then it has to be arbitrary. Then every subsidiarity has to be arbitrary, but it's not. And then you run into the problem you just described.
Yeah, and it's funny because in some ways, the modern scientist type should be able to perceive this, is that it really is like natural systems, the way that society functions, because what you have is you have cells, and those cells, like, they exist for the unity of a being, right? They don't only just exist on their own. And so individuals have a level of existence, but individuals don't exist without families. They just don't exist. They have no way of being without being in interrelation with other people. And so you necessarily need all of this to stack up, right? That's the best way to see it. And it's the most natural way for the world to exist. It imitates all kinds of natural systems that we see in biology. And if you're not careful, you create the problem of fragility, which is exactly what globalism does. Because it was funny, because of all people, I remember I saw an interview with Elon Musk, like somewhere in Saudi Arabia or something, some weird thing, where they were asking Elon Musk, like, we need a global government, like, we need to move. And Elon Musk was saying, no, you can't, because if you do that, then you just have one thing. And if it falls, then everything falls. You actually do need several empires and multiplicity, because if one of them starts to decay, then the other one will take up the space, and you have like a natural competition that doesn't necessarily have to just be seen as warring, but rather as really, like I said, like natural systems. And so if you only have one way of doing things and only one pyramid, if that pyramid starts to shake, then that's it. Then you have an apocalypse, you have an Armageddon, everything falls apart, because
Yeah, I agree, ultimately. But yeah, this idea of competition of different, it's also just this, as any subsidiary model, the, especially in terms of politicals, then you understand that there is a healthy limit to it. Like under certain moments, that there is a natural limit to it. Let's say that's why I'm talking. Let's say an empire is a natural limit of a particular subsidiarity. Yes, any empire has this element of global universality. I admit, coming back from Roman Empire, which
Yeah.
considered to be the empire of the world as we know it, but it's exactly more like an aspiration. Historically, it's impossible for any political empire to become a true one global empire. The ambition, if anything, is good because it makes them like to be better, to exactly this element of competition which
Yeah.
rationalists like, but they never really ascribe to become this one controlling prison guardian which world government inevitably has to lean forward. But
But in some ways,
you
we have
mentioned,
to be the problem is that we have the Roman Empire. I think I agree with what you're saying completely, but we have a problem now, which is that now we have technology that actually makes it possible. So the Roman Empire couldn't, like you said, their aspiration to be in some ways the global empire, you know that it was limited by their reach, by their, and when they overreached, they paid the price for it because, they basically overreached their capacity to actually control these things. And
integrate,
then,
yeah.
yeah, and then the mercenaries that they were using to continue to increase their like reach finally said, well, I don't align with you, I might as well just be a thing and now attack towards the inside. But with this is the problem, is that technology makes it, technology and AI and all these things make a global government actually possible. uh because now you don't need mercenaries, you just need robots. Like,
Mm.
I mean, I know that sounds, you just need drones. Like, you just need to have drones fly over everybody, just kill it, you just blow up a few houses once in a while to remind people we're watching you. Like, an absolute authoritarian world government is, yeah, I don't know if it's possible, but at least the dream of it is far more, like the dream that people have of it is closer than what the Romans or the Persians had access to.
I see what you I see what you mean, and yeah, it is definitely closer. But I think here is a completely different pattern which is on our side. I actually don't remember this line in English, but do you remember when Mary praises the Lord in the second chapter of Luke, praises the Lord and says that he dispersed the arrogant with the intention of their hearts. I see.
Mm-hmm.
I'm translating, so maybe in English it sounds slightly
Mm-hmm.
different, but I think that's effectively the same element which will happen in this story.
Yeah.
So they won't be defeated by this idea to create a total idiosyncrasy on the Tower of Babel level, and we can actually now talk a little bit about it as a symbol because I think it's a perfect example. The very complexity of the structure, the very arrogance of the structure will be the root of its own demise. It
Yeah.
won't be the root demise of, like, let's say, contra-revolutionary movement. No revolutionary movement will defeat this tower, but it will collapse on its own. That's what I think will
Yeah.
happen. But
And
until
you're
then, yeah,
right,
it
because
will see.
we have an example of it, right? Which is the Soviet Empire collapsed on its own. It's not like, although there were, Americans and other people were trying to influence, they were trying to do things in order to kind of bring it down, but it didn't, like you said, come up with a counter-revolutionary movement. It basically just petered out because the amount of control that the amount of control that it exercised of centralization was not sustainable and created lack of alignment fractally, right? So, this is also the problem with it's already the problem with the nation state, which is that it's their responsibility. It's not me. I'm just a taxpayer, a consumer. I'm just I'm not actually a member of a body. I don't feel allegiance in the way that I care for my family. I have an abstract allegiance, maybe, but and the only way that people are able to reawaken the allegiance to a state is war, right? And so you have war. So, oh, now we're together. Now we're like you. Now we're this people, and now we're going to fight this other people. But if you have a global government, what are you going to do? I guess you need aliens. You need
You
extraterrestrials.
need
Like you need alien enemies or something. Because then you
or
just have
absolutely.
basically just going to fall apart because nobody is going to
No,
feel
but
allegiance
that's
to
why
the.
actually you can you bring this for the second time you brought the question of war, and I now I will indulge myself because speaking of like the theory of war is one of my favorite topics to discuss honestly, and it is not coincidental because actually the question of war is the question of this whole sovereignty. Because ironically, if a state, being it a nation state or an empire state, is not allowed to wage war, then it's not the one that holds the power.
Of course
Like it
not.
or not, but historically, it's the right to wage war is the political right. And when we, after World War II, created this ape of the United Nations, which says no, there will be no wars, and wars are illegal, we don't allow any wars. You kind of exactly created the foundation for this next step, and then why do you need states at all, in a way? On top of it, you created the gigantic problem of hypocrisy because if you look into, once again, if you
Yeah.
look into real history, there was wars. We just don't call them this way anymore. Like
Yeah.
that's the most ironic thing. Like people often like it's remarkable that there is no wars. Like what United States is in Iraq, it's not war. What is happening
Yeah.
between Russia and Ukraine right now, it's not war. Legally, it's not war. And
Yeah.
like there was no wars like for the last 70 years. And it's kind of this example of this clown war you're talking a lot
Yeah, but we're
about
not
because
idiots. Like, we're not. I think that if we're having this conversation, we're not of you,
yeah.
neither of us are the type of person that just listens to the dribble that comes out of the official sources. And the same
No,
with
but
the
it is
media.
important. I would agree. It is important why even those in power don't call it war. I think
Yeah.
there is an actual important seed in it because they don't treat themselves as properly sovereign, and that
Mm.
so I guess to me it's a sign that a certain shift towards the Bible has already happened. Like it
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's happened like 70 years ago on a very fundamental level. I guess so. That was my
That's
argument.
an
So
interesting idea. I never thought of that. Like, it's an interesting idea to say that the fact that nation states, for example, like the United States have basically been in war since World War II, nonstop. They're just like the Korean War, the Vietnam War. You just keep like they've been at war without end. And so, but the fact that nobody wants to actually call it war that is an interesting idea. Like you said, it means that even though it's hypocritical, it means that somehow everyone has accepted that the capacity to wage war is no longer justifiable in any way. Like there's no justification for it. And so but we do name wars, right? We do call them wars, but it's not the people, the powerful agents, they tend to avoid it.
it's gray zone. It's always fluid. It's war on terror. It's a culture war. It's something else, but
Yeah.
it's not.
But we do say Vietnam War, like we do say Korean War. We do say they do say the war in Iraq, although that's a colloquial term, but for sure in the United States, I don't think the US has voted for war. I don't
Oh,
forget since.
legally, like no, historically, as you know, there is it was a very clear like act called Declaration of War. Like
Yeah,
it is a document. Like historically,
yeah,
you needed to declare like that the country even in World War II, like there is like you can look like for example Britain is declaring war on Germany. Like there is an
yeah,
official state that since like 12 p.m. this day we are in a state of war. That's
yeah,
what I mean, and this is gone. Like this
yeah,
is
yeah.
gone completely.
Well, for sure
Like
now it's gone, and also because the a lot of it has to do with the way that America considers itself, like its own identity, and the manner in which it wages, it's constantly waging war for its interests, but it also um, masks it in the interests of the people that they fight where they fight, and in some ways, sometimes I've always wondered if that is also a kind of remainder of a veneer of Christianity, right? This veneer of Christianity where we feel like we have to say, no, we're going in Iraq, because we want to help the
people.
Iraqis. Like we're going in Syria because we want to help the Syrians. Yeah. Which is a very strange way of doing war, but it seems that, like you said, to be the way that at least the modern West does war.
It's not just, but I can tell you, it's not just the West. It generally became a global paradigm.
Yeah.
I guess, you can argue that the United States maybe were one of the first who really cemented this model in their actions, and it is very interesting like story and so on. For an outsider, United States is definitely a very interesting case, because I based on my conversation actually believe Americans when they say these things. The problem is it doesn't change the fact that what they are actually doing is a normal historical power struggle, etc., etc. You perceive it as a benevolent, let's say, acting in this realm of ideas and care, but it doesn't change the fact that it is what it is in reality. But there is this very interesting gap which creates with, as here comes a big difference between the Americans perceive themselves and the rest of the world perceive
Yeah,
Americans.
yeah, of course.
But it's just very interesting topic. But let's come back a little bit, because
Yeah,
we
yeah, yeah. We got quite
derailed.
off
Unfortunately, it's
the
fascinating. So
no worries.
I just want to come back to, I think, the issue of cornerstone issues. So because we talked about it like different elements, how it's not working. So let's talk a little bit how it works. I would to be a little bit more positive. And one of the quotes of yours from one of, again, your videos, which I loved it a lot, like about what is a political community. And the quote is that mysticism happens every time you encounter unity in the world. And for me, then there is a question. So is it a who, not a world, not a what, or if that holds a political community together? So it is mystical in nature. And I guess I wanted to maybe you to elaborate a little bit on
why
it.
is it mystical in nature? So
Yeah.
I mean, I think, like you said, like when you quoted it, that you have to understand that the mysticism of the experience of unity, it happens, way lower than the political sphere, right? It happens every time you perceive unity, because the qualities of the unit, right? Like we say, the whole is more than the parts, right? That something that has a unitary identity cannot be the multiplicity of it, the parts of it cannot account for the quality of its unity, right? That's what they call emergence, whatever, like that word that people use. But that is true at every level that we perceive unity, and then it's true as a person. And so the unity of the person, right? The fact that I have a unity cannot be accounted for. And like my brain is a bunch of things going off, my body is a bunch of things doing things, but nonetheless, I have a push towards unity within me, and that is the soul, right? We don't like using that word, the spirit. There's a sense in which it's the place where, and so that is necessary for all multiplicity to join into one. And so you can understand now, like, why families, for example, like that families in many cultures will have things like they had family gods, for example, or that they had patron saints, or they had this notion of a kind of guardian angel of the family, because we notice the unity of the family coming together. And we're made of a bunch of people, but we feel, that's just not a feeling, but it is a capacity to recognize the unity. And that scales, right? It scales into communities, into parishes, it scales into cities. Like, for example, in Italy during the Middle Ages, it was the city state that was strong, where people had, or even during the Hellenistic period, people identified with their city, their body politic, and saw that as having a common identity, but they were still capable of seeing themselves as Hellenes, as having also a higher identity that pulled them together into that type of common space. And they had ritual ways of acknowledging and participating in that. And so that keeps on scaling. And at every level, there's opportunity and danger. And that's really important. Like, I think even, when we started the conversation, I wanted to mention that, which is that empire can be horrible. A nation can be horrible. Families can be horrible, and a person can be horrible. And so it's important to acknowledge that, and to not to paint a simple rosy picture of these structures, right? Julius Caesar bragged that he killed 1 million Gauls. Like, he was proud of doing that in order to bring them into the empire. So these are horrible acts that all of these levels of power do, but they also at the same time offer opportunities which are real and should not be denied as well. And we shouldn't say, well, just so the Roman Empire killed all these people, so it's horrible. The answer is yes. But also, the Roman Empire provided communication and peace amongst these people, at the same time. And so we have to be able to see the good and bad of all these.
And you need to judge the historical story. It's this rose, like, just because, like, before, like, I think 3 decades before Julius started his whole crusade, no, not crusade, whole like invasion in the Gauls. The Gauls came to Rome and almost destroyed the Rome. So like it's not like, you
Yeah.
know, there is
No, it's not a
you won't
one-way
find a
thing.
good peaceful guy in history. Basically, you won't find
No,
a good guy
no,
who was just, you know, innocent, peace-loving community. Which, like, no, the moment you step into history, you will do
it gets
things
bloody.
which,
Yeah,
yeah, it get bloody. Yeah, so
yeah,
just
yeah.
sorry.
Oh, I agree. I agree. No, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to paint either way as being right. I just want to show that it's important to understand that. But so nonetheless, what happens is there is a type of mystical unity, which is exhilarating. And this is important for people to understand it's exhilarating because you, just like when you're in a sports team and all of a sudden you feel this unity, right? You're working together and you're winning the game, and all of a sudden you feel this kind of sense of being elated into the identity. And like again, that provides opportunity, but it also provides danger. I mean, it's like you can weaponize that in crazy ways, which we saw in the modern nation state.
Exactly, but okay, then just let's talk a little bit more about this danger, because I think it's one of the things we're missing in our modern conversation is the distinguishing between two types of danger, and I think a lot of let's say misunderstanding and manipulation happens here. So one danger is, in my understanding, you can call it natural, and yes, I will reference Christianity, is just the consequences of sin. Sorry,
Mhm.
there is a danger in sin, and as you said, in individual, family, nation, state, etc., etc., etc. It's the danger of I would call it, you can call it natural entropy, or basically something can go wrong all the time. You are not perfect. Nothing is ever really perfect. And one of the Russian philosophers, Nikolai Berdyaev, has this very, I think, important to hear now phrase that the purpose of a state is not to create heaven on earth, it's not to let it to devolve in hell. Like,
Mhm.
so,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
so,
It's a good point.
and you can argue it's also a pattern. So the point of yours is not to create heaven on earth. It's not to let your soul in hell. The point of the family is not to create, let's say, you know, literally create heaven on earth. But where manipulation happens, if we forget looking about this, admitting the, well, and that comes with rationalism and enlightenment, because it kind of destroyed it. If we forget to accept that we are limited, and
Mm.
we do forget, because we consider us first progressive, and then we consider us to being this humanist man who is way better than everybody who has ever been
Yeah.
before. History really started with us. Before us there was only darkness, where the light which come. And then, sorry, that is the basic pattern of thinking.
Oh yeah.
Then you leave no room for imperfection. Then you leave
Right.
no room for imperfection into anything, and then you have to look to any authority figure to precisely destroy the imperfections which you are still witnessing, because they are natural. But you cannot accept their natural cause, so you have to you have to ascribe them exclusively to human-made causes, like
Mm.
to the other causes. You, if anything, create causes which explains the imperfections around itself. And that's one big conundrum happening. And then, of course, there is a second conundrum you are talking about, that there is an element of potential corruption in any structure if you effectively turn it to the wrong purpose. That's another thing. But they are different things. But if you can at least address the second, you can, because we can talk about what is a good purpose, what is a good
Mm.
telos, what is good, what is bad. So we can talk about it. And maybe we can, yeah, try to, through, you know, transforming the hearts, education, talking. It's very interesting that for the most part of history, the political treatise, and Machiavelli was the one who broke the traditions, they were not about how it works and how to gain power, but what kind of person we need in power. So what kind of heart should be that they make the decisions. So how we educate, let's say, the sovereign, the monarch, etc., etc. And we can talk about it. So how not to let into dissolve into this tyranny. But it's not the conversation we are having. The real conversation we are having is this labyrinth of fighting against imperfections which are irreducible, and I think that was
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
completely missed.
That's a
So,
great, I mean, I think that's a great point. You know, interesting. This is an interesting moment that I had because uh, I had a taxi driver, a Moroccan man, you know, nice guy, living in Canada, talking about COVID now in 20 after COVID was over, and in saying just how horrible it was in Morocco, because in Morocco they didn't do anything, like they didn't have masks, they didn't have all this stuff, and I'm like listening to the guy, and I asked him, I said, was there a difference in death toll in Morocco and Canada? He said, no, not really. Like, was there a difference and he's like, no, not really. And I said, and I was like, so what's the problem? He said, well, at least they managed it. And it was like, that's the thing. It's this idea that what are you going to do? There's a problem. Like, there's an imperfection in the system, and this weird idea, like you said, that somehow we have this weird idea that now the state has to fill up this imperfection with its authority for the simple fact that the imperfection exists, which is insane, because it leads to this kind of Tower of Babel, thinking. Whereas the natural way of being would say yeah, that's right, you're right, people die and people get sick and bad things happen, and that's part of life, and if we want the state to cover every single bad thing that happens, we are setting ourselves up for a tyranny. Like, it's going to happen. You can't avoid the corollaries of that authority in your life.
But also not just, I think that's important to highlight. It's exactly the pattern. Let's say if you want your family to cover up for any imperfection which you have on your own, it's the same problem
it's
arises.
The same problem. You're right. No, you're exactly right. That's the right way to think about it. But even in your will, like, you have the same problem inside you, which is that if you try without, like, the guidance of a spiritual father or someone helping you, if you try to, like, get rid of all your sins, you are in serious danger, my friend, because you're going to run right into a wall. And it's like people who try to establish crazy disciplines, right? Or like dieting, for example, like, oh, I have this problem, like, I'm going to diet like crazy, and then then you meet them a year later and they've gained another 30 pounds because they collapse.
And they are unhappy. The only difference is they are now also very unhappy because they failed to achieve what they...
and they're unhappy.
Yeah. And
no, that's a good point. That's a good point of the idea that in some ways, to understand the state of the fall and to understand the need to acknowledge imperfection. So, there's this tradition in late Middle Ages. It was called the Nine Worthies. I don't know if you know about this political tradition. So basically, it was the thinkers in the late Middle Ages had identified 9 characters in history that were important and in some ways models. So 3 from the pagan past, 3 from the Old Testament, and then 3 from the modern, for the medieval era, right? And what they would do is they would say something like Alexander, right? Alexander is a great man. He's one of the worthies. And they would say, here are the great things he did, and here are his sins. And they would do that for all the characters. And it was like, now we have this weird idea, right? We can't stomach imperfection in even our historical figures. And so you see that in America, people like tearing down statues because someone wasn't Jesus, basically. It's like, oh, he wasn't God, so we have to destroy everything, like every memory of them, because they weren't perfect, which is nuts.
Well, I think here happening like super trick, honestly. But like, first thing, it's not just about this 9 worthy tradition. I've just running a class on Plutarch, like for like my projects, and then we read Plutarch. Like, whenever you read any description of person, like it's full of imperfection. Like, it's worth it to and that's the way people understood history. Actually, for the most part of our existence, we understood history as stories, and that was very clear. It's a story of a nation. If it's a story of a person, of course it will have failures, but it can successes and failures. It's like nobody expected perfection from anything. We claim what we learn from it. That's important thing. We learn from it. Like, let's say, in this situation he did this, so maybe if the similar pattern arises in your life, you are not the first one who encountered it. This way of thinking is completely lost to us, but it's not but again, it comes back to this whole idea of freeze of time, the nature of time, because we simultaneously, exactly, whereas the light before us was darkness, like that's the basic pattern of thinking. Like, nobody can think about past and anything but darkness. And people think that's why we're judging the past from the lenses of the present. But I actually think there is a trick happening, and maybe you didn't hear, like, I'm curious what you will say, is that it's not like just with judging past from the perspective of the present. We are protecting our present from being judged through the eyes of our past. I think there is this trick happening, because how it looks in practical. would you rather have your politician be like, I don't know, who was, I don't know, great Canadian parliamentarian of the 19th century? Sorry, not familiar, but
Yeah,
a
neither am
person.
I.
But point being, or your modern politician.
Yeah, yeah,
Think
yeah,
about it.
yeah, yeah.
The
I mean,
standards, read the speeches, read the
yeah,
language, like
yeah,
simply read the speeches the way they speak in parliament in 19th century, like even in the 19th century, not
mhm,
going, let's say, in the medieval, but
yeah.
just read the way they speak and read the way it is spoken now. Like, don't I think this anger towards the past, it's not just the anger towards imperfections towards the past, it's mostly anger towards that we subconsciously know we are not really better than our past, but our whole, let's say, political theology is centered around it, that it was wrong and now we discovered the key how it must be done, and etc, etc, etc. So many things are playing out. I think it's not just one directional story, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting insight, because in some ways there it's a feint, right? It's like actually a weird feint where we are actually much worse than the ancients, and we're more stupid. Like, the citizenry is less involved, less educated, less aware of the issues. And even though we're a democracy, it's like we're a democracy, but nobody's aware of any of the issues. At least in our countries, like in Canada and America, we never discuss any actual political or economic issues. It's all bluster. It's just insane. It's all just like kind of empty political rhetoric. Our prime minister is astounding. Like, Justin Trudeau is amazing. Like, he is something to behold, because he can speak for 5 minutes, and then you say, okay, so what did he say? And you realize there's no content in his speech, and he is the Prime Minister of Canada. He's not dealing with any of the issues. He's just saying, as Canadians, we take this seriously and we're going to consider it, and we know that the Canadians are with us because this is an issue that is important to us. And he can do that in an entire speech, and he's actually not saying anything. It's astounding. And you're right. I think that's right. Is that in some ways this weird contraction of the past, like this weird desire to, you know, make the past as short as possible too. This is also something that's happening, is that you see that in the United States, especially, right? Like, the whole slavery question in the United States is funny because people act as if the only thing that exists is the kind of transatlantic slave trade, in the modern age, and that everything about us is related to that, but there's nothing around it. Like, there's no history. Nobody knows anything about any history before that. That's a great insight. It's an interesting insight and it like contracts everything into this moment. And then when you end up having are these really vague idea of progress.
Chimeras, yeah, like effectively, yeah, and
And
progress, yeah.
yeah,
Sorry,
and
yeah,
the
go on.
progress thing is a mystery to me. It's one of the most mysterious aspects of modern politics, because progress necessarily has to be teleological, because you have to be able to measure progress towards a purpose. But the progress that the modern politician talks about, or the modern political class talks about, is a vague, open-ended progress that we don't know actually what it is. It just
Uh,
means something like more. Is it more equality, more,
It's
less,
heaven on earth. No, I think we know what it is. Like, again, we know what it
the
is.
kind of
It is
utopia?
progress. Is
Yeah.
heaven on earth right here, right now.
Yeah, all right.
Like I
Probably a good. It's a utopian. It's a new utopian vision, really.
but it's always been the case because actual, like, I don't know if you know about this whole Hopson idea, but the Hopson idea, we kind of keep forgetting where this idea of modern progress is coming from. And one of it was actual gigantic disillusionment of Europe after the 30 years old war, which started our age. We live in the age of modernity for last 400 years, and it started with 30 years war, just for the audience who might not be aware. And it was devastating, like, and people were really devastated, like, and thinkers were really devastated. It was a despair, and despair was in part because the root cause of the 30 years world war, 30 years, you can argue, world war, was that different versions of heaven been fighting each other and
Mhm.
killing each other.
Yeah.
And they decided, okay, So it's not, so the Hobbes personally, that was his idea. Okay, we cannot fight about whose version of heaven is right. So let's just put this question outside of the box and let's kind of freeze our eschatological and historical time. And the goal of the state is to keep the society effectively frozen until the second coming. Jesus will come, he will solve this problem, we don't have to address it. But it's impossible not to address it because yeah, I'm giving up my card.
This is how Hobbes spoke. I mean, I don't know my
It's
Hobbes. Did
effective.
he actually had an
Yeah.
eschatological aspect to his
Oh yeah,
vision?
no, he was literally arguing against Paul. Like his writing he was directly paraphrasing Paul. Where Paul has the church, Hobbes has the state. And it's literal, like line by line. I don't have it right in front of me, but maybe in the next time, or like outside we can talk about it. No, Hobbes is it's exactly he's deeply theological. He's a Leviathan, and you might it fascinating because you are the symbolism of the Leviathan you are discovering right now. But it's not arbitrary. Like it's a very theological. It's so deeply rooted in Christian tradition. It's addressing Christian tradition. And ultimate question he's trying is, so how do we live? We know that there is a second coming, but we don't know when. So how do we live until this when? And he was because previous way of living until this when he saw around himself is like mass murder, and he was legitimately terrified, traumatized, and scared man because he was born on the day the Spanish Armada was kind of moving towards Britain. Like so all these things were really deeply affected him, and he was really trying, and his solution was, so let's just freeze it. Let's just freeze this question. Let's just pretend they're not important. Let's just talk about different things. But as we discussed before, you cannot, because it is the questions. It is mystical. Any unity is a mystical unity. And then you start, like in 100 years, see theology taking its revenge, just in its secular form, in the form of French Revolution, and then in the form of Enlightenment. It's exactly the same manner he was trying to freeze, but he didn't understand it's impossible to freeze. But we keep pretending it's possible to freeze. That's an interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting insight. And I do think for sure, that in some ways, I mean, a lot of the modern political ideas, they have definitely a kind of religious aspect to it. Like the very idea of progress, like you said, in some ways it is it's a weird religious idea in this vision of something, this like the heavenly city or something, and that it's vague enough so that it can draw us into it, but it is this. Yeah, that's a fascinating idea.
I think honestly that's actually the difference, Jonathan, because it's simultaneously vague, but the purpose is not to be drawn to it. The purpose is to have it here, right now. That's I think the true even difference with, let's say, the Aquinas project to bring the city of God to the city of man. And he at least understood it's a process, and he didn't expect it to happen like immediately. And it was a long term. And now we have this paradox. At the same time, it's really vague, as you said. It's really hard to put in all of the description, but we must have it right here, right now. It is very important to have it right here, right now. If it's not happening within the next presidential term, we are doomed. Like we are doomed. Like,
well, also because there's let's say the globalists also use apocalyptic environmentalism, to fuel the movement, and it's fascinating to watch how it's interchangeable in their mind. And I don't know how conscious it is, where it's like there's a relationship in their mind between, let's say, racism and environmentalism, and they're able to kind of jumble it together as this like social program where we have to be a certain way. But the vision, I mean, I don't know, because I don't totally, because I'm not a progressive, right? I can kind of enter into that thinking to some extent, and I understand some of the reactions, let's say, of the desire for variability in a system that's too set, right? I kind of understand that and I see it, but the vision that even they have, it's ultimately seems to be anti-human, and that's what I don't totally like. That's what I think it's satanic in that sense. Like I hate to use that word too clearly. I think it's like a weird trickery, like this weird trickery that the liberation from forms of control, right, is simultaneously creating stronger and stronger forms of control at the same time. And that ultimately it actually leads to a desire for the elimination of the human, which is it's hard to wrap your head around it, but it seems to be that's what the case of what we see happening.
Uh, I I can offer you a way of
Yeah,
wrapping.
go
Like,
for it.
sorry, like, so 2 points. The first is it's not elimination of control. It's elimination of control where you are not the controller. So it's the whole one of the what unites like radical environmentalist and anti-racism is the hatred towards hierarchy. Again, in that
Yeah,
sense, they oppose the production of hierarchy, and that's why they're so that's the connecting point. They hate any
yeah,
form of hierarchy, and we're coming back to the point. It comes back, unfortunately, to liberal individualism, because
yeah,
if you consider liberal individualism from from a starting point of your thought, then any form of hierarchy is imposed on them. It's not natural, it's not organic. So until you get this perfect moment that any form of subsidiarity around you is consciously chosen by you in an absolute free environment with now further external influence, then you are not free. And they want to be this man. They want to be the man that chooses every single form of subsidiarity constantly, and it's
yeah,
not once and for all, but every single moment. You can argue it's a little bit schizophrenic, but whatever, that's how they see it. Like, so the idea is like, because there is an element of it, and I think Jonathan Peterson talks a little bit about it, that any name, any identity does indeed have a tyrannical element in itself. The
yeah,
moment you accept certainty upon it, the moment you accept identity, there is an element of control in it. There is an element, something you must surrender to it. And
yeah,
they don't want to surrender anything. They want to be the one to whom it is surrendered.
yeah. All
So
right,
you see
so
how this trick it's working.
I don't see how it's related to environmentalism, and I'll tell you why. Because so let's take, I mean, the LGBT stuff, uh, that's clear. Like you can see that is in some ways, the ultimate liberal act, which is self-determination, self-naming. I'm actually not even dependent on any form of constraint, even in my body, even social constraint. Like there's no constraint. I break open the constraints and I become a rainbow, right? It's like it's all multiplicity, right? Um, and so that's but then the environmental thing is a call for absolute control.
But it's absolute
It's
control
saying,
where we are in charge and not evil capitalism. This
right,
is a power. So I told you. So the same way it's me who controls my body, it should be me who controls the planet, not some hierarchical capitalist structure. See? So
yeah, yeah,
for
I
them,
kind of see it.
for them it works. I know it's a little bit tricky, but it makes sense as long as so is basically the lie is they claim that they want no structures, but it's a lie. They want the structure with them in control, but
Yeah,
still the whole pattern is that in that sense the true liberation exactly happens from any non-arbitrary hierarchy, and every hierarchy should be arbitrary and conscious and like chosen by me voluntarily. So that's one important thing. But I think there is a thing deeper in it, and it's connected to what we were talking before, and that's my hypothesis. But I think
mm-hmm.
it comes very deep to Gnostic tradition, to Manichaean
Oh, yeah.
tradition, and it is a confusion of two things. I don't know if we have time to talk about it, between respect and love. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually a Western thing, which could just now spread across the globe. Because I think, especially in the West, like it's a very long story how it developed, but you as an Orthodox can see it. There is this kind of this weird mixture that something which is not perfect or something which is not worthy of respect is also not worthy of love.
Mm-hmm.
There is this thing which plays again in the Western culture, and but as we've been talking before, because of the sinful nature, there is constantly a lot of imperfection. There is not that much in reality in the society which is a true worthy of respect. Okay, there is like a king, authority figure, somebody who is successful, etc., etc., etc. But it won't be the majority. America tries to solve it through like capitalism and everyone be worthy of respect, but I can straightforward say no. Like many people will be left out. Many people
Mm-hmm.
are left out if the only thing which is lovable is the one. Basically, if you make love and respect the same, then you have so many people left out of both. And I think that's where this whole game coming from. Because then they think so because we want to be loved, like everybody wants to be loved, etc., etc. Then we have to through society, through these different elements, to make us worthy. But at the same time, they're not addressing the core issues that imperfect, something which is rejected. Like here is the whole Christ figure is coming, and he shows that love is for everyone, not for just something which is worthy of respect. He never says that you should respect the poor, like in a sense, societal, that you should put them on pedestal, but he says you should love them. But because this distinction is lost, I think that's how the deep seed is coming into their thinking. So that's why they consider themselves just. That's why they consider themselves doing the good thing. That's what kind of. But it's a hypothesis.
It's an interesting hypothesis. I'm kind of testing it out in my mind on different things. Because so this is the way that I tend to approach it is really through the idea that extremes necessarily call each other. That's the way that I tend to think about it. And so that's why when I see a move towards idiosyncrasy, what I notice is that there's a move towards control that happens simultaneously. And that move towards control becomes more and more tyrannical as the move towards idiosyncrasy functions. And so to me, that's the only way to explain certain things. So for example, like the relationship between self-naming and you being whatever it is that you want to be, and you could just say what you are, you're a cat, you're a whatever, and that you can become whatever you want, that and cancel culture, at the outset you think, how do those things fit together? But it's because one necessitates the other by its very idiosyncratic emphasis, right? And so that to me is the way that I explained also the relationship between globalist control tendencies. Like that's why there was it was so weird, like it was so weird during COVID to watch the alignments, right? To watch the rainbow people align with absolute state control over every aspect of your life, and it was like, how did this work? But I realized that in some ways that this was a necessary thing.
Sorry, just a quick
because let me just say one more thing, is that what happens is that on the one hand, and even in this rainbow culture, you have something like, you should love me just the way I am, right? You should love you should not judge me, you should love me. But then in it, there's this insane level of judgment that will basically, force you to do like that can destroy your career, destroy your life, destroy all of your reputation.
Because it's not love. Because again, there is a trick, I think, which is happening. Because it's not about love; it's about chosen. And it's unfortunately this derivative of American Protestantism. Because again, I think I was wrong. That is that only chosen can be loved, only pure can be loved, only perfect can be loved. And like chosen who is saved, the whole doctrine of servitude to the elect. So what's the name love? It's like, you should love me. No, I should be elect. I am the elect, and it's all competition of different statuses of elect. So I cannot be elect in capitalist system, and I think it's wrong. I don't think your quote unquote electability should be based on your economic success. It's a different story, but that's why I think they kind of created this. But then so we cannot compete this, so we create an alternative way of competition, but for the same thing. So now we're elect because we are rainbow. Now we're elect because we are wearing a mask. And the goal of the state is to effectively give you a passport paper. You are the elect one. That's what they're fighting for.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting idea. And so then the social credit system tendency that we're moving towards makes sense. It's like you basically want God to tell you you're of the chosen people, but because we don't believe in God, we want the state to do it, to say you're a good boy, like you're the one, and now people should love you.
And now people, exactly, you're the good one, and now people should love you. Yes.
Yeah. Exactly. That's an interesting idea, because usually the way that functions, right, is organic. There's an organic process by which we discover, respect, and love, and a type of election, right? Because if I marry someone, I elect them. If I if I hire people, I elect them. And so there's this kind of organic process. But the tendency is to want to find a way to be an elect that shortcuts all of that, and like the state
shortcut because it's all tyrannical and bad, because they're not arbitrary. I'm not free in this, because in their mind, because I was born into family. For example, I'm not loved by my family, and I was born into it. What?
Yeah, and so the strange Brave New World vision that you see in some of those cultures where you should not be allowed to refuse to sleep with someone. Like you see that in some of the rainbow stuff where it's like, I'm a trans this, and it's like it's unacceptable that you don't want to sleep with me. Like you should, and it's like there's this weird implying that almost like the state should force you to sleep
Because
with.
otherwise you're denying me my chosen status. Because
Exactly,
otherwise
you're
you're telling
denying
me
my
I'm not the
identity by not. Oh, yeah. That's an interesting idea. I'd have to play that out in my mind. Also, like to see what the corollaries are. Yeah. To see so this is interesting also in the idea, you see that in the book of Revelation, you see these two images, right? One is the image of the number of the beast, right? So the beast gives you a number, gives you a name, right? In for all intents and purposes, and that makes you part of the system. And now, without that, you cannot be recognized. Like nobody can recognize you unless you have that name. But then there's another image in the same book, which is that God places on you a secret name, like a name that is only your name, and that is your true elect nature, like in the sense that you are made in the image of God, or
true
something
name.
like that.
Effectively, your true name.
Your true name, right? And so it's like these two images of where it is that we get our value from. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the difference is that like the mark of the beast is visible and the mark of the god is invisible.
Yeah,
And I
it's
see,
hidden. It's a hidden. It says
but
there
that's
are different
exactly,
images of it.
but that's
We'll
exactly
put your
this.
name on a stone, like a white stone that only you will know. Like there's this secret aspect to it for sure.
But see,
Yeah.
that's the thing. That's where for us, everyone as a human, I think that's the challenge because this hidden element, there is no certainty. Like you don't know, and that's like what the Christian culture has been struggling for like millennia. We have to admit that people wanted to be saved, but they were anxious about it. Because you don't know, are you saved or you're not? If it's the most important question, if it is hidden, so it's a constant exercise in this humility. It's a constant exercise of surrendering yourself, and you can humanly understand the desire. I just want a paper. I just want somebody to tell me for sure, being it God or state. I don't like,
Give
just
me my
give me,
ticket. That's right.
give me my ticket. Give me in both ways. Either I'm in or I'm out, but don't torture me with this uncertainty. I think that's one of the I think like it's something psychological here involved that we cannot
Yeah,
really.
but that's interesting. I would never have put a Calvinist twist on this. Uh, but it is something to think about for sure. It's something to consider in terms of this idea of a kind of certainty of election in you, right? Which is the traditional way of understanding the certainty of election is that the certainty of election is in Christ. It's not in you. Like
Exactly. No, exactly. Yeah.
But bringing it into the individualism, like linking it to individualism, brings that weird kind of state. Um, yeah, and then wanting to be chosen by something that makes it public that you are to be loved, let's say,
And then
something like
effectively you
that.
just have competition on the criteria. On which criteria we're giving this paper. Is it money? Is it race? Is it nation? Is it class? Is it gender? It's just a competition on which criteria we're giving the paper. Like that, then it's kind of whole just develops into it. And that's how, but so what unites all of these different people who kind of hate each other often is precisely the principle, which we kind of, this whole idea of chosenness not through Christ. Which I think actually is a great way of saying it, which you mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely insightful. My mind is going a mile a minute, so I would definitely have to think about some of the things we're talking about to see how they kind of how they jive with other things that I've been thinking about. But it's definitely an interesting way of thinking about the problem that we're dealing with now. Yeah, for sure.
Just again, so I guess we can talk more about it next time, hopefully. So, if you don't mind, I just wanted to say how it is. Bring it back to the whole political idea
Yeah.
because I think there is this whole element also about this chosenness and surrendering yourself to Christ or not in a way that, and here people might argue, but you know that in Maximus the Confessor he speaks that all of the logoses were effectively created before time. And effectively that all of the identities you can argue as a similar pattern are pre-created. Like all true identities are pre-created. And another challenge for modern and rationalist and Enlightenment thinking, which goes into all these different patterns we describe, is to accept it, because we understand identity as something we create, is something we choose, and to surrender to something, it's something which we should receive and not control. That's a big ultimate challenge, but it's also the core challenge, which also kind of unites all of these different elements together. That would be my last, I guess, point. And
yeah, I think, I mean, that definitely makes sense, and in some ways that is the one of the aspects of subsidiarity, and the idea of how identity is received, right? It comes from heaven. It's hard for modernists to hear language like that, but there's a manner in which identity is the precondition for the being to come together towards a purpose, right? So you could say that an identity is a purpose calling multiplicity into its unity, uh, and that this, like you said, is received, and all the sins of the big sins in the Bible, whether it's the sin of Adam and Eve, whether it's the sin of Satan, even if it's the sin of Saint Peter, is a sin of self-naming, self-identifying, right? And Saint Maximus the Confessor, he identifies that himself as what he calls the sins of the right hand, which is this idea that it's the first sin is always a sin of not receiving from God, right? Of trying to contain an identity fully in itself and to own it at its level. And that then leads to breakdown, right? It's an image of the Tower of Babel. Saint Maximus obviously thinks in all these things together. Like, if you try to hold on to something and make it real completely on its own, then it shatters.
but just how it works in the political language, just I should have started with example.
Yeah, go for it.
I was arguing in a simple example idea that we think that we can take any group of people and make them a state just because we recognize this as such, for example, or make it a nation just because we recognize, without all the different subsidiarity relations there. It was very evidently, after the so-called decolonization process, when Western empires were just leaving, and these are the borders that we created, so just you take them and live in them without an understanding that they're not corresponding to anything. But that's exactly the same pattern. So we just come and make whatever we want, including like states, and it doesn't work. They must grow, and yeah, part of organic growth is competition, fighting. Yes, it can get bloody, but there is a pattern. But back to your point, exactly, it's massive confessor. So like, for us, it's just hard to accept that it's not us who creates identities on all level, being on personal, family, structural, political, global, which goes on a global level. It's exactly as you said, the same pattern. We can create this name and identity for ourselves, not receive it, but we can create.
No, that's exactly that. I think that that intuition is right, and in some ways, that is, and there's a type of humility, right, which is that, when you're born in a family, right, you don't choose your family, you don't, and your family comes with all the sins and all the virtues of that family. And I think it's the same with our participation in different peoples. Like, I'm French Canadian, right? And so I don't choose that. I'm born into that reality. If I try to deny it for some universalist thing, and I tried to self-create my identity, then I'm denying, aspects of what I am, and it's not useful. It's better to acknowledge the virtues and the sins, and to try to cover the sins of my father, right? To cover the nakedness of my father as I move forward. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you just said, and I guess for the rest of the questions we raised, we can talk next time when you have time.
Sure. Yeah, but I think like the difficulty that we have now is in some ways because we're facing these global solutions. Like, we're noticing the global solutions kind of establish themselves, and we're actually seeing them as, competing or trying to compete with national interest. The question is, what can we do? Because it can really bring us into a state of despair, because we're presented with the vision of an individual in this global citizenship, right? But I do think that the solution that we can do is recreate subsidiarity at the local level, right? And that is to be a father, to be in a family, to be a member of a community, whether it's a church, whether it's different aspects, and that building of subsidiarity will offer resilience when the Tower of Babel falls.
Yes, we can develop this. So basically, I completely agree with you. That's exactly the same advice I give when people ask me, okay, so it's all well and good, but what we do? Well, basically, I have to admit I'm borrowing this ethos of yours because I agree with it. I would just add one step, which in my opinion is necessary for it exactly on a level of a soul. You need to recreate subsidiarity between you and something higher than you, because it is, in my opinion, the foundation for all of the other subsidiarities which you've been describing. But it's just a nitpicking from my side. And other than that, effectively, you just said it's just I would say it's a paraphrase of what we have in the 36th Psalm, which says, "Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, so shall thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed." So kind of, again, we are not the first one who dealing with it. I think that's we're constantly missing this element. We are not. Yes, technology makes it seem that we are in a more dangerous situation because, let's say, the scale is bigger, but the pattern is the same. And the towers of Babel have already fallen multiple times. It's not the first time it's happening. So so another practical advice, actually, read history, and then you don't feel so lonely. So then you don't feel
said,
that
I think the psalm you quoted is great, and it's like love God and love your neighbor. That's it. Like if you do that, then that's the only solution. It's the one that Christ gave us. And that's the solution to the subsidiarity problem. Because if you do that, then they'll have natural relationships with things around you, and you won't be.
To what extent it works? Yeah, maybe in better times it will be bigger circle of relationship. Maybe in the worst time when everything starts falling apart, it will be the circle of your city or like the circle of your neighborhood. But it's like not for us to know there was recently the ascension. Then it's not for you to know the time, and it's not for you to know the times. We are told. So it's not for us to know the times, but it's for us to do what we can. And but to understand it, I think you do need to, and that's your favorite subject, which I agree with completely. You need to know the stories. I would argue that without stories, without embodied stories like people, you cannot really orient yourself in this maze. Because we've been talking for an hour and a half, and it's just the beginning of this maze. Our think is so trapped in these different loopholes which seem self-evident, but we don't understand why self-evident. We don't understand what is unifying them. So it takes time, but other than that, you can keep the optimism going, and the best way is the stories. So I think just in the end want to mention that the story can kind of summarize or even better, what you do is image. An image can summarize an hour and a half political theology conversation into one image, and you can look upon it and see it in everything, and that's also a good place to start.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, again, then, so I'm very grateful for the generosity of your time. I'm very grateful for your coming for this meeting, and I hope many will follow in the future. Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Pavel. Yeah, it was great to talk to you. I really enjoyed it.